My name is Glenn Story. Last year, I produced a series of programs about Green Meadow, the Palo Alto neighborhood that I live in. One of the people we interviewed for that series was former Congressman Pete McCloskey, who had been an attorney for Green Meadow. We found him to be an interesting storyteller with fascinating insights into politics and life in this area from the 1950s through to the present. Unfortunately, there were several parts of that interview we couldn't use in the Green Meadow series simply because they were not about Green Meadow. And so I'm using this opportunity to share more of that interview with you. The interviewer was Stephen Eichler, who was the host of the Green Meadow series. So join me now in watching this interview with Pete McCloskey.
I'm Pete McCloskey. It's June 20th, 1994. And just about 40 years ago, maybe 38 years ago, when I was a young lawyer and didn't have any gray hair, and before I'd been in politics, I and my wife, after trying to live in Alameda County and being a district attorney in Oakland, decided that I wanted to be a country lawyer. And Palo Alto had 40 lawyers in it at that time, and so we came back and we looked at some houses under construction by a very famous builder named Eichler. And Joe Eichler was a canny old gentleman, but he was building 243 homes, and he did it with a combination of glass and wood. That it was a very charming. They were garden apartment houses. And we looked at one, and it was in the days when if you were a veteran, you paid nothing down and got a 4.5% loan. So any young couple with 2 or 3 children, which was me, and no income, could afford an Eichler home. And we looked at this tract. It was called Green Meadow, and it was built in a lovely 243 homes around I would say, an acre community center. It had a nice lawn and a building and a big swimming pool. And one of the great selling features of Green Meadow was that if you bought the house, you got a lifetime right to use that swimming pool. And man, that looked pretty good in a hot summer to people with young kids. And the community building looked like it was just right for daycare and, park your kids. And we looked at it, and we didn't buy. We ultimately came out to Ladera, just outside of Menlo Park in the hills, and bought a house there for nothing down and a 4.5%. But shortly after I started to practice law, I hung out my shingle, and I didn't have any clients. I didn't have any prospective clients. But a young couple came to me from Eichler, and they had bought a home in the Green Meadow tract, and they were, I won't say outraged, but terribly disappointed when after the 243rd home was sold by the Eichler empire, because it was an empire. He built half the houses in South Palo Alto, I think, in various parts of time, and Palo Alto was spreading out towards Mountain View, which was a sort of a cherry orchard town that was really a cannery town. Mountain View and Sunnyvale started as rural, built around the orchards of what was in the lovely Santa Clara Valley. And after he'd sold the 243rd home, it appeared in the paper that Mr. Eichler had leased the swimming pool to a famous swimming pool operator who was going to pay a substantial sum of money and give swimming lessons on the property. And the residents said, well, if he's going to lease it, how many hours a day is he going to lease it for, and will we only get it in the odd hours? And it appeared that that was the case. So they hired me, and I think I charged $5 per head. I don't think all 243 homes had been purchased then, but in any event, at least 50 people put up $5 each and came to me, and I found a case where the identical thing had happened back in the 20s in a park north of Los Angeles in the mountains, where they had sold homes based on the common use of a common area, and then the developer had sort of pulled back the unrestricted use of the common area. And these Green Meadow folks, there were about 10 driving forces. 2 of them later went to the city council of Palo Alto. One became mayor. John Burwald, Chris Swang, who was a famous eye doctor, developed the laser beam surgery later. But these were all young couples. They all had 3 or 4 kids, and they wanted to use that swimming pool more hours than Mr. Eichler had allowed after he announced his lease. And I told them, I said, well, you got 14 couples, but the first name, the case is always going to be known as Jones versus Eichler or Burwald versus Eichler, and none of them wanted to have their name in the lawsuit. None of them ever been in the lawsuit. And I prepared this complaint alleging that they had a right to use that swimming pool. And they drew straws, and the guy that lost was a brassiere salesman. I think it was Jim Farr, name like that, Farr or Farquhar. So the case was Farr versus Eichler. And the guy said, but you know, we kind of like old Joe Eichler. He's built these great homes. We love these homes. Let's see if we can talk him out of having to sue him. So Burwald and Zwing and I went over to see Joe Eichler, and we sat in his office, and I said, Joe, we all have a lot of respect for you. Here's the complaint we've got to file tomorrow in case you're going to stick to this position that these people don't want to or don't get to use the pool except when your swimming instructor allows them. And Joe leaned back and he looked at this complaint and versus Eichler and talked about the promises that had been made and all these young couples that had put their future in his hands. And he looks back, he looks at me, he says, I'll tell you what. He says, if you guys will put together an association and give me $20,000, drop this lawsuit, I'll give you the pool. And they looked at each other, and we looked, and we negotiated a little, and it was finally agreed that for $10,000, he would transfer title of that to the Green Meadow Association. We then formed the Green Meadow Community Association, 243 members, and if you owned a lot, you were entitled to a lifetime right to use that pool. And everybody put up $50, so that for the $50, they had just enough to raise the $10,000, and I think pay me the largest fee I had ever received, something like $1,000. And they took title. But it was more than that, because most of these were young couples. There were a few old retired couples, but most of them were young couples with kids that were just coming to Palo Alto to make it the town what it has now become. Most of them later became very successful. But the board meetings, they ran as a civic operation, and I was just a starting lawyer, struggling. I didn't have much law business. And suddenly, one of the Eichler homes burned down, and it wasn't quite in the 243. He built 5 or 6 subdivisions right around, and this house burned down. There's one thing about an Eichler home. They're made of enough wood and glass so that if a fire ever starts, and this thing went down in about 4 minutes. I mean, it started from a blaze, and it was gone. And somebody called the fire department. And, of course, at that point in time, they had Yorkshire phone numbers, which was the Mountain View Exchange. It was about a half-mile north of San Antonio Road that had been the dividing line between Old Palo Alto and Mountain View, and it was just fields for many years. But the fire department that responded was the Mountain View Fire Department, and it roared right up to the city line, and this house was over the line in Palo Alto, and it's a gift of public funds for Mountain View to serve a fire in Palo Alto. So this fire truck roars up to the county line and stops, and by the time they get a Palo Alto fire truck there, the place is burned down. So the Green Meadow people are now about doubled in size. 500 of them came to me and said, Pete, would you represent us to get our phone numbers changed to a Palo Alto number? This fire is an outrage, and worse than that, when we try to go down to the Stanford Shopping Center, which was the class place you went to shop in those days, the sales lady would say, well, what's your phone number? And they'd give a Palo Alto address and a Yorkshire number, and the salesperson would look at them and say, well, you're from Mountain View. That's a local. I mean, you couldn't cash a check if you're from Mountain View in Palo Alto. It wasn't racist. It was just sort of a view in the CC stores that anybody with a Yorkshire phone number had to be a cherry picker or a fruit rancher. So we brought the lawsuit, and it was one of the greatest things that ever happened. The public hearing examiner for the phone company, and nobody had ever done this, although we found one case, and again in the 20s, where on Tustin they had changed a boundary, but the phone company said, no, we can't change a boundary. Everybody would want to change their boundary. We just can't do that. And they sent down a young lawyer named Charlie Renfrew, who later became a federal judge and assistant assistant deputy U.S. Attorney General. And he's now, I think, the head of Exxon, if he hasn't retired. But he brought 24 guys in dark suits and briefcases, and they set up the community center, and these 24 guys each took their time reading their testimony. And meanwhile, the wives of Green Meadow were giving the examiner lemonade and cookies and saying, "Oh, Mr. Examiner," and bustling around and just making him feel like he was at home. Well, he came out with a decision. The great thing was the fire chief. The fire chief of Palo Alto was retired, and he came and he testified. He says, "You know, I told them years ago that they ought to change the city limits line and the phone line because this could happen." And that was enough. And the decision gave 500 people a new Palo Alto phone number, and they each paid me $1. I remember that. $500 I got. But I had 500 happy clients. Now, you say, what does that mean? Well, there's a law firm now that I founded off those 500 happy clients. It was called McCloskey, Wilson, and Mosier. It's now Wilson, Goodrich, Rosati, and something. Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati. They're the biggest law firm in Palo Alto. They're probably in the peninsula. They brought all of the big L.A. and San Francisco firms have come down to try to compete with that law firm. And that law firm was founded on my friends of the Green Meadow Association, and I guess when I ran for Congress in '67, nearly all of them helped me. But the association stayed together over the years because they shared the center. I haven't followed it in recent years as much, but they maintained a community sense that they knew each other and they knew their kids in the school, and it was built around that community center. And so I think old Joe Eichler would be proud of it today. But I thought he was fairly wise to say, "Hey, I'll buy it. Forget the lawsuit." I wish more people did that today. A lot of people looked at the Green Meadow experiment, and it became fashionable in the late 50s to form swim and tennis clubs. The University Club over on the Stanford campus, the Ladera Oaks at Ladera, the one that was in the old Mancini's property. All of those, as I say, I sort of built my law practice representing groups in the community, and forming those swim and tennis clubs was one thing. One day, I think it was about 1959, a guy showed up in my office and put his bowler hat in the corner of my desk, and he said, "Well, Mr. McCloskey," he said, "we're finding all over the state that people are taking a tax exemption for these swim and tennis clubs, and they really shouldn't be exempt at all." And he said, "I've just come down from Los Angeles where we've collected $370,000 back taxes, and I want to look at your records of the Green Meadow Association and Ladera Oaks and whatever these other three were." And I said, "Well, why pick me?" And he says, "Well, because you're the attorney for all of these associations, and they're all very successful, and I figure I'm going to take away about $200,000 in back taxes for these four that you formed." Well, the happiest day of my life was about 6 months later when he picked up his bowler hat and walked out and said, "You win." And all of these, we had followed the letter of the law, and they'd kept their tax exemption. But as I say, John Burwell went on to be a community leader. He was the first president. I think Chris was the second. But all of those young couples, in following their careers, have been very successful. They, I think, to a couple, and sometimes the woman has been more successful than the man. Well, I'll tell you how I got into politics. It's an interesting kind of a story. I was sitting in my law office. Wilson, what our firm was, McCloskey, Wilson, Mosier, was not by any means that successful. And in 1963, I got a telegram. And it said, "Would you join me and other distinguished leaders of the bar in the East Room of the White House at 4 p.m. Thursday? John F. Kennedy." Well, first of all, I wasn't a distinguished leader at the bar. I'd been president of the Palo Alto Bar Association, and I'd been a civil rights lawyer. But it turned out that I was invited to this awesome assemblage in Washington in early June 1963 because a friend of mine had been a platoon leader in the same company in Korea, and he worked for Jack Kennedy in the White House. He was part of the Irish Mafia that looked after the relationships of the Kennedy administration with the Congress, a very difficult task. Kennedy was not markedly successful with the Congress in his presidency. But in any event, man, I was on that plane. I got there about an hour early. I'm sitting in the White House in awe, and Jack Kennedy comes out, and he looks at 300 lawyers sitting there, all men. He says, gentlemen, he says, I need your help. He said, people think the President of the United States has great powers. He said, but I need your help. You can do something that I can't. Bobby Kennedy's on one side of him, Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, on the other. There's half a dozen Secret Service. He's standing behind this thing with the seal of the presidency of the United States, the rose gardens out in the window, and it was awesome. I was then 36 years old. He said 2 months ago in Birmingham, Alabama, the blacks rioted because they got tired of sitting in the back of buses and being segregated at lunch counters, and they exercised a historic, traditional American right. He said, when you don't get redress of your grievances, you go to the barricades, as we did against Great Britain. He said, now, this is going to happen, not just in Birmingham, it's going to happen in every city in the country, because the blacks are taking over the cities as the whites move out to the suburbs, which is very true. In the early 60s, Green Meadow and Palo Alto were all expanding. If you had one income, you lived in Africa, in Atherton with 1 acre. If you had no income, you lived in a 50-foot lot in Redwood City. If you got a little more income, you moved to Woodside. But the whites were moving to the suburbs. The inner cities were become poorer and poorer. He said the reason it happened in Birmingham is that the blacks had nobody to talk to. The whites wouldn't talk to them, the power structure. He said, I'm not asking you gentlemen to represent black people, but I'd like you to go back to your communities and form committees of black and white lawyers to make sure that when blacks have a grievance, you communicate. He says, you guys don't only sue people, you settle cases. You tell your client when the other side has a reasonable case, and you get rid of litigation. He said, you're communicators. He said, I can't do that as president, but you can. Okay, I guess I was invited to that civil rights conference in part because we took a position against the original proposition, I think it was 13 or 14, was to give everybody the right to buy or sell their home to whomever they choose, which translates mean I don't need to sell it to a black person or a Jewish person or an Arab or whatever you happen to be opposed to. And we haven't licked that problem yet in California. We've got a long record of discrimination, going back to Indians and Japanese and Chinese. And
does any other state really have it licked?
I don't know. I know, because I'm a fourth-generation Californian, that, we wouldn't let the Japanese. When I was in law school, the topic that my debate partner and I debated in the Stanford Moot Court finals in 1950, and you'd recognize my Moot Court debate partner's name was John Ehrlichman. The topic was, should California's miscegenation law be held unconstitutional? In 1950, it was against the law for a white person to marry a black, a Chinese, a Filipino, or a mulatto. It was against the law. It was a crime. He went to jail. O.J. Simpson couldn't marry that gal in 1950. So, that's in our lifetimes. That's only 40 years ago. The Supreme Court finally did strike it down as unconstitutional in 1954. But I worry that racism is coming back, that you're seeing the restoration of anger on the blacks, anger on the whites, anger on people that want to make their community their own. I mean, white people want to live with white people. Black people want to live with black people. I mean, it's both ways. It isn't a, and that's unfortunate. We'll struggle with that for the next 100 years, I guess. But if you're writing a book about your grandfather, you really ought to stress that thing that he did, because he was a leader at a time when people were not entirely sympathetic with Joe Eichler's ideas that a black guy lived next door. And people don't like to talk about these things. I can recall, I think Green Meadow was desegregated from the beginning. I think there were black, because young people could buy. And Joe Eichler would sell to them. Some of the guys wouldn't. Well, I walked out of the room about 3 feet in the air. The President of the United States had asked me to help him solve a major problem. And we came back and we took the first black lawyer in East Palo Alto and the Peninsula. We took him into our firm, which was a fairly good law firm, Harry Braymond. And we tried to find ways that the blacks in East Palo Alto could communicate with the mayors and the Chamber of Commerce. got Bank of America to put a branch out there, and they hired black girls as tellers so that if you went into the bank, you realized you could get a job when you got through high school. And I was so impressed. I was a Republican. I hadn't liked Kennedy appointing his brother Attorney General. But he had caused me to do something I wouldn't have done, and that's leadership. And I asked my friend, I said, what should I study if I someday want to run for Congress? Well, the guy said, you're a Republican. He said, no Democratic congressman will talk to you. And he says, there aren't any good Republican congressmen, which is just exactly the view of the Kennedy White House and is today of the Clinton White House. There aren't any good Republicans. And then he says, wait a minute, there's one guy who'll talk to you. And he calls him, and the guy says, yeah, I'll see him. And so I went over the next day, and I sat down with a young lawyer in his shirt sleeves Friday afternoon. And I said, look, I've never thought of politics as anything but a dirty business populated by people that couldn't make it in their other lives. But I was so impressed, I think I'd like to study for the Congress. I knew I didn't want to be in local government. I said, what should I do? The guy says, very simple. He says, first, you take a good newspaper. He says, there are only two in the country, the New York Times and the Washington Post, one that reports the news and not just editorial comment. He said, second, subscribe to a thing called the Congressional Quarterly, which is put out every week, and it describes each issue and each amendment and the votes and the arguments. That'll get you up to speed on if you have to run, so you won't sound like an idiot. He says, the third thing, he says, the most important thing is that you get involved in your community and everything that's going on, hospitals, youth work, housing, education, whatever's going on. Well, I'd been the president of the bar. I'd been the family service board. I was head of something called the Fair Play Council, which tried to end discrimination in housing. And I was involved. But most of all, I had about 30 of these citizens groups, like the Green Meadow Association or the Committee for Green Foothills, or people that were engaged in trying to either preserve the environment or to help some local community. And we essentially fought against government. Well, I guess it was 3 years later, our congressman died, and I ran for Congress. But I wouldn't have done it except for Jack Kennedy and my friend in the Marine Corps, and I certainly wouldn't have been in a position to do it except for this sort of broad base of citizen support, like the Green Meadow Association. And those people, gosh, I wasn't supposed to beat Shirley Temple, but they got out and walked precincts on the election day and turned out a vote, and we won. So I can say with some assurance that anytime Green Meadow calls me and asks me to do something, I'll do it. And they have little problems from time to time.
Do you remember what the issues were then when you first ran?
Yeah, the Vietnam War. I had volunteered to go to Vietnam. I was a lieutenant colonel in the reserve, and I had fought in Korea, and I believed that the United Nations, that you ought to have a peacekeeping force. But when I looked at the history and the background of Vietnam, it was just an outrage. I mean, we destroyed much of what we had built up since World War II, pride in our country, pride in the military, the willingness of young men, rich and poor, to serve the country. We destroyed all of that in a war that was an outrage, I thought. But I was elected at a time when Lyndon Johnson was running the war, and Nixon came in with a plan to end it, and it turned out his plan was to just bomb them into the Stone Age. And so I took on Nixon, and politics, the first 5 years I made the first speech to impeach Nixon. I was the co-chairman of Earth Day. I didn't fit the Republican image. I was the only Republican congressman out here, and the Republican Party thought I was really a Democrat. In many ways, I suppose I am today, but the Republican Party has become the party against women's right of choice. They're really now no longer the civil rights party. They're certainly not the environmental party that they once were. So I'm sort of I would say a has-been. There aren't any liberal Republicans anymore. Our district is now, it was held by two very good men, Ed Shaw and Tom Campbell, but we now have Ann Ashew, who will be a better congressperson than any of us, and I doubt that we'll see a Republican congressperson from this area. So I'm sort of a vanishing breed. I can't speak for them in recent years because I haven't, George Eby, who was sort of the dean, he was one of those young Turks that first formed it. John Burwald is still there, but my God, John's in his 70s, retired. He's still a force for public good. There were more people per capita in Green Meadow that cared about civic affairs and public affairs and international affairs than most places. But they also had a homogeneous, they were all young couples. I mean, I would say the average age of the people that bought their first Green Meadow house was somewhere between 28 and 35. I mean, it was mostly young people. And when my wife and I and our 4 children went out in Ladera, to give you an idea, Ladera had a thriving school with 3 or 4 children per family. 30 years later, the prices had gone from $20,000 a house to $250,000 a house. A young couple with children couldn't afford to buy it, and the school actually shut down. The public school in Ladera shut down because nobody with kids could afford to live there. And you've seen that change in the neighborhoods. Remember when Coverly High School was created, Green Meadow had a cohesion as a community. They had a cohesion as people of common goals of educating their children. You had a high school right next door. One of the great missing elements of what I would call the country when it was in better shape and was when you had a sense of community. When people in Palo Alto, you know, you build a YMCA or you went to different churches. But Green Meadow had a rare sense of community that I think has lasted in some measure far beyond other subdivisions because of this common sharing of the pool and the community center. But it's hard to find community anymore. People tend to have their community with their kids' soccer team or the dancing class. Even the schools are not so much the focus of a community any longer as they used to be. So, I don't know, you'd like to see more places with that sense of community where people feel they help each other or have a common bond. Now it's more security. I think people worry about the neighborhood watch that some serial killer will come in, as happened over in Castro Valley the other day, or pulled Polly Klaas out of a home in Petaluma. I don't know. I mean, I'm not deploring the past. I'm just saying that Green Meadow in its youth was a thriving, active, fun place with a lot of fun people. And I hope it is today. But I haven't seen it. In this town of Woodside, there's something like 5,000 people and maybe 6,000 horses, and there's no real sense of community. I mean, the new rich, the nouveau riche of Silicon Valley have not had the same sense of obligation to put charitable contributions into a community. Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett put their money back into the Palo Alto community, and you can see the ideals of that generation reflected in the kinds of charitable things that they support. If you went down to the 20 leading heads of Silicon Valley companies and said, will you support this worthy cause? The last one I found any agreement on was paying high school physics and math teachers $20,000 extra a year to keep them teaching physics and math, so you'd get a flow through the high schools and the junior colleges of people qualified to work in Silicon Valley. But that's a little self-serving. I don't know. We live this place that Leland Stanford picked back in 1888. It's favored in every way. Our weather is best. Our smog blows over to the East Bay. 10 miles north, it's 10 degrees colder. 10 miles south, it's 10 degrees hotter. Stanford is here. The World Cup soccer is being played as we speak. It's a favored community.